Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today we'll talk about a very special family in the 18th and the 19th centuries. That is the royal family. And as you will see, some aspects of social life during the Enlightenment and the sentimentalism are reflected in the lives of the royal family, and in some aspects, even you might say that the royal family were originators of certain trends. So, first of all, as you hopefully know by now, the dynasty on the throne throughout the 18th century and the 19th century were the Hanoverians. So, after the death of Queen Anne, the last of the Stuarts, the new dynasty was invited by the parliament to the British throne. These were the Hanoverians. They were the closest Protestant relatives of the Stuarts. We talked a little bit about the problems with the Catholic branch of the Stuarts, which led to the Jacobite rebellion, which was finally crushed in the middle of the 18th century, and the Catholic Stuarts never really managed to regain the crown, and the Hanoverians were practically safe on the throne. This is why this period is sometimes called the Georgian times, because the first four kings from this dynasty were called George. So George I, George II, then George III, who was not actually the son of George II, but his grandson, but the Prince of Wales, the father of George III, died even before his own father. He was killed in a sporting accident. So George III took the throne after his grandfather died, and he had a very long reign. He had a 60 years long reign, so the longest before Victoria, and of course the present Queen Elizabeth II. However, something that we have already mentioned to some extent, George III's reign was marked by periods of his illness, especially his mental illness. Towards the end of his reign, he was completely incapacitated. He was also losing his eyesight, so he spent the last 10 or so years basically locked away in Windsor Castle, and that is why the Prince of Wales, who would later become George IV, ruled for 10 years in between the years 1810 and 1820 as the Prince Regent. So sometimes this period is called the Regency. We'll talk about it in greater extent later on from the social perspective. Now we only stick to the royal family. Sometimes the term Regency is used for the entire period of the beginning of the 19th century, before Victoria came to the throne. So after George IV, there was his brother, because George IV also left no surviving heirs. We'll talk about it in a little moment. His brother, not called George, but William IV, and only after his death in 1837, Victoria came to the throne. She was the daughter of yet another younger brother. So, as you can see from this very short introduction, the royal history of the late 18th century and the early 19th century is marked by very deep dynastic crisis. The royal family has problems in securing the succession, so of course there were many children in the royal family, but either they did not produce offspring, or they did not produce legitimate offspring, and of course any illegitimate children were excluded from the inheritance of the royal throne. One thing that goes back basically to the beginning of the Hanoverian dynasty on the British throne at least, is the problems that the reigning monarchs would have with their eldest sons, with the Princess of Wales. And if we look at the relationship between George I and the future George II and the George II and his eldest son, the one who died young, also George III and his eldest son, the future George IV, and even if we look at Victoria and her eldest son, future King Edward VII, there has always been trouble. There has always been, in some cases, you might even call it intense dislike or perhaps even hatred between the King or Queen and the Prince of Wales. There was something in this family, one historian called it quite bluntly, that the Hanoverians were like pigs and they trampled their young. Definitely the practices of child rearing, especially in rich aristocratic families, still continued to be quite distant in the first half of the 18th century. So both George I and George II did not really engage so much as parents, as fathers to their children. But George III, you may remember him from this collection of royal portraits by Thomas Gainsborough. He not only fathered a whole brood of children, he and his wife, German Princess Charlotte, later Queen Charlotte of course, they had 15 children together, but especially before his illness, George III tried to follow the new ideas of more loving family life, more devoted family life, and he tried to take an active part in raising his children himself. When the princess and princesses were very young, they basically lived together as a big, happy, or at least theoretically happy family in a small royal palace, which is now on the grounds of the Kew Gardens. Then, of course, in the 18th century, it was not yet the Royal Botanical Garden, or it was just beginning, and part of it belonged to the royal family. So if you ever go to the Kew Botanical Gardens on the outskirts of London, you can visit the Kew Palace. And the Kew Palace was the place where George III tried to raise his family, to raise his many children, especially the sons. But it didn't really work that well. Perhaps when they were small, when they were young kids, it worked. But when they became teenagers, when they started to mature, the royal children and especially the royal sons started to be a serious problem for the royal family because of two things. First of all, they loved to party and they loved to spend, especially the public money, on their own private pleasures. And secondly, the boys did not want to get married officially to the officially approved by the king and the parliament, because the law said that to be a legally married wife of the aristocrat, of the royal person, the candidate needed to be approved by the parliament as well. So of course the parliament would approve of an appropriate Protestant princess. That is why the Hanoverians mostly married German princesses finally, when they decided to do that. But before that, for years and years on end, they would lead very liberal lives with mistresses, with sometimes illegitimate children that would not be recognized by the royal court. So what you have is a lot of public criticism, and you have to remember that the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century is the time when the literacy of the society is growing, when the press begins to be a very important medium, and when the reading public starts to really develop into the public opinion in the modern sense. This is a very important thing that will be especially valid in the life of the Prince Regent, the future George IV. So the family of George III. Very unpopular. You have a lot of poetry at this time criticizing the princess, criticizing the royal family. There is one little poem that was published after the death of George IV, so in 1820 or around that time. And let me quote it to you. It goes like this. I think the Georges for Providence could stand no more. Some say that far the worst of all the four was George the First. Yet by others it is reckoned that worser still was George the Second. And what mortal ever heard any good of George the Third? When George the Fourth from earth descended, thank God the line of Georges ended. So actually the obituary of King George IV in the British press stated explicitly that he was the least mourned monarch in the history of England, and his only value for history could be to serve as a negative example for future monarchs. Why was he so unpopular? First of all, he had a completely different personality than his father George III, who before his bouts of insanity was quite a likable person. He was rather modest in his tastes. He did not like big parties. Some say he was the first British king to be faithful to his wife, so he didn't take any mistresses, and he liked gardening. Sometimes the press mocked him for it. They called him Farmer George, but otherwise he was quite well liked before, of course, all the calamities started to happen. First was the fact that he started to evidently lose his senses. There are different hypotheses of what was wrong with him. A very popular one is that he had a genetic disorder called porphyria, which was some sort of mineral deficiency in his body that in his case demonstrated itself through psychiatric symptoms. Anyway, he got himself entangled in a series of bad political decisions. The worst was the series of decisions that led to the proclamation of independence of the American colonies. So he was the king that famously lost America, and then he lost his mind. But in terms of his personality, he was quite liked, unlike his sons. Especially the eldest one, George, also later the Prince Regent, later still George IV. When he was a young, dashing man, he was called Prinny by the press. Later on, he started gaining weight because of his great predilection for parties, for feasts, for kind of good life that most of the reading public of the press could not really afford. So what we have is caricatures of George IV. You may want to Google it, the caricatures of George IV or the caricatures of the Prince Regent. And probably one that really stays in mind is a caricature in which he is presented as a whale, this big animal, and of course the caption reads, the Prince of Wales, but not Wales like the whales, but Wales like the animals. Also, he was presented, of course, as a glutton, as a drunkard. He was partial to drugs as well because his health, his physical health started failing. So he took drugs for his pains. Of course, at the turn of the 19th century, nobody really knew how dangerous it was and how addictive it was, so it cannot really be raised against him, but this was definitely something that influenced his political style. He was also a romantic man in the sense that he fell in love quite often. He had a particular taste for ladies that were slightly older than himself and also quite corpulent. So this was, of course, again, feed for all those caricaturists that would draw him as a very fat man dancing or embracing equally fat ladies. So that was again something that was raised against him. But the worst thing was that he did not get married, that he did not choose a proper Protestant German princess, produce legitimate offspring, but he spent his time and the public money on parties and romances. There was a particularly notorious romance with a Catholic lady, which of course in the eyes of the English made it even worse. Her name was Maria Fitzherbert. Some said that they were secretly married. Of course, this marriage that was not accepted, was not valid for the royal family and for the parliament. So even if it happened, it didn't mean anything. In the end, when the money was really getting scarce, the Prince Regent, the Prince of Wales, was persuaded to separate from his mistresses and to find himself a proper, legitimate Protestant princess somewhere in Germany, to get married and to father a child. That would be the next in line. And here comes a very dramatic story from the beginning of the 19th century. The cats, goodness. In which, let's check on the cats.